Welcome to Excess Returns, where we focus on what works over the long term in the markets. Join us as we talk about the strategies and tactics that can help you become a better long-term investor.
Justin Carbonell and Jack Forehand are principals at VALIDEA Capital Management. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of VALIDEA Capital. No information on this podcast should be construed as investment advice. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of clients of VALIDEA Capital.
All right, so today we're going to go outside of our normal discussions around investing, and we're going to talk about podcasting. Jack, that's something that you and I might be just a little bit dangerous about. Of course, we're not expert podcasters and we don't do this full time, but I think, we have maybe at this point, almost 230 episodes of Excess Returns and another maybe, half dozen or maybe 30 episodes of Education of a Financial Planner and other podcasts that we've either been part of or helped produce. So what we thought we'd do today is take a shot at sort of a behind the podcast episode, which is where we'll sort of talk about our experiences in launching Excess Returns, growing Excess Returns, what we've learned along the way, what we've done right, what we've done wrong. And then as a sort of to piggyback off this episode, what we're also going to do is talk to other podcasters, people that we know, that we've admired maybe, or that we listen to their podcast extensively and sort of talk to them. And so this series will be about podcasting, how to launch a podcast. I think what, people can learn from sort of the behind the scenes, and then, we'll sort of just see where this goes. But this is sort of very different for us, but I think it'll be fun to kind of work through this stuff.
Yeah, there's so much that goes into this. There's so many different areas you touch when we started doing this, I don't think we had any idea. I mean, first of all, when we started doing this, it was you and me talking about an article one of us had written. I mean, that was basically the entire podcast, but I don't think we knew like all that goes into it. Not just, there's obviously a technical setup you have to have. There's certain things you have to put together to be able to run the podcast behind the scenes, but there's like, how do you grow the podcast? How do you figure out topics to talk about? Who do you interview? There's so many things going on. And then, you have optimization. When you start doing things like YouTube, there's crazy amount of stuff like optimization that goes on behind the scenes to try to, optimize things for the YouTube algorithm. So it's just, to me, starting the series is about us learning from other people, like people we, know who probably do a better job of asking questions than we do of the guests. And so it's a great opportunity for us to learn from them. But, we figured it was only fair if we were going to ask other people these questions. Maybe one of the first things we should do is ask ourselves. So, this is a good opportunity for us to step through from the beginning, sort of how we've done what we've done. Like you mentioned, we're not the biggest podcast out there, but we have grown to a decent size, and, there's things that have worked and there's things that haven't worked. And so hopefully we can kind of cover some of that as we work through this.
Well, if anybody wants to get a good laugh, just go back to like the first 20 episodes that Jack and I recorded, where it's just you and I talking about, like you said, rehashing an article, kind of stumbling on each other, even though we chopped those up, pretty well at the beginning, and we still do that today. We'll sort of talk about some of that. But let's just talk about
by the way, I still remember the first episode it was called The Mechanics of Value Investing. And we had to like redo it. I think the third one is the one we finally used. Like there was like, I was rocking in a chair too much at one point. Like there was weird stuff going on. Like I just remember we had to like, just to get that, and that episode's still out there, and it's certainly not as good as what we do now, but it took us like 3 iterations just to get that thing out.
Well, and that's one important lesson right up front is anybody listening to this that's thinking about starting a podcast out of the gate, it's not going to be perfect. It's going to be far from perfect. Part of it with you and I was just jumping in and doing it. And we weren't comfortable on camera. We weren't comfortable rewatching ourselves or listening to ourselves talk. And we still might not be that comfortable doing that. But, we did it. We jumped into it sort of head first and we embraced it. And sort of that's what in this part, one lesson that I would sort of encourage. But let's talk a little bit about what were some of the other early initial lessons in there, including, maybe our decision to get up on YouTube?
Yeah, we took this from Toby. A lot of Tobias Carlisle, like a lot of the stuff we did initially was based on what he had done, because he had started his podcast, Acquirers Podcast, which back then he was doing a lot of interviews, ahead of ours. But one of the things he did that a lot of podcasts were not doing at that time is he put it on YouTube. And so we said, we're filming this anyway. We might as well put it on YouTube. And I think that was a good decision, because I think we probably are bigger now on YouTube than we are on the audio platforms. And so I think for us, that was a good idea. I mean, other podcasts I know don't do it, or they do it, but they don't put up video. They just put like the audio up on YouTube. So, it depends on if you're comfortable, if you want to be on the camera, or if your guests want to be on camera as well. But for us, I think that was a big decision. was to get up on YouTube because, the thing with YouTube is there's a couple things YouTube has that the audio platforms don't have. And the biggest one is the algorithm. In Apple Podcasts, there's not really an algorithm that says, if you're watching this podcast, let me serve up a bunch of other stuff that's similar. A Spotify, I mean, they have that, but it's not major. Like with YouTube, and we've learned this, and we'll talk about this later. We've learned this throughout the, doing this, like there's a huge range in terms of the amount of times our episodes are viewed. And that's because of the algorithm. Like when the algorithm latches on to something, we've had episodes that have 30,000 views on YouTube when our normal one probably gets 1,000. And you won't see that on the audio side. The audio side, they're pretty tight. They grow over time, but like one episode to the next, they're pretty tight. So I think that this YouTube decision was a really good one from the algorithm standpoint and also from the standpoint of search. If you go Google anybody who's been on our podcast, you probably won't see too many podcasts prominently displayed right at the beginning, but you will see usually like 3 YouTube videos with that person. And so that was really big for us, like getting up in that search.
And I also think YouTube, because of the way the content is displayed on your channel, at least for us, it helps us make or show the robustness of our podcast. I mean, there's multiple episodes on there. We have the cover art, which we'll talk about. But, it sort of acts as almost like a storyboard or a launching point for anyone that touches that channel to just showcase how much variation we have in the various topics that we've talked about amongst ourselves and also with guests. But the other thing I wanted to say is that, and this is to the audio, the importance of audio is, the content is digested very differently. On YouTube, people are watching, much shorter clips, much less of the video. Whereas when somebody's listening to an audio podcast, they may throw it on in the car, they may go out for a walk, they may be exercising at the gym. So the way that the content is, consumed is actually very different from the two platforms, and they both serve their purpose. But I think for us, the important thing was we wanted to have diversity in terms of how people were consuming that content.
Yeah. And also it's really is not any more work to do that. I mean, it is more work in terms of you do have to post it in multiple places. And, we were taking the video anyway, so it wasn't too much more work for us to do it on YouTube. So for us, it made sense to do it across everywhere. But I know there's a lot of podcasts we watch that do or listen to that do it in different ways. Some people just have it up on YouTube, but there's a background picture in there and don't have video of the people. Some people don't have it on YouTube at all. But for us, I think it was a good decision. I think when we look back like 5 years from now, if we're still doing this, and hopefully we are, we'll say that was probably, the most important decision we made, maybe, because I think we'll probably grow a lot more on YouTube than we will, on the audio side.
What are your thoughts on that early period at the beginning with growth? I mean, the one thing that we had a little bit of an advantage of is we had, a captive list of email addresses through the VALIDEA blog email that we were able to push this content out to. I mean, you and I don't have huge followers on Twitter or LinkedIn, so we had to rely on our own internal distribution list. But I mean, out of the gate, it was tough. I mean, I don't know what those early videos got, but I mean, maybe like 30 or 40 views at the outset. So being able to see through that was sort of tough, but we continued to do it and just look for different growth opportunities, I think, along the way.
Yeah, I remember the first video got a decent amount of views, but that was because Tobias Carlo shared it on Twitter. And then after that, we're like, oh, this is going to be going straight up. And then it actually went straight down. But yeah, I mean, it's tough. It was tough for us. And, Michael and Ben have done a really good job of this with Animal Spirits, but it's tough to grow a podcast when you have, just the hosts and you don't have guests on. It's much more challenging because, when you have guests, they bring the audience with them. And when it's just you, there's no one with like an incentive to share it. I mean, obviously people who like it will share it, but for us, like it was hard to grow with just us. And so I think there was a point here, and I think that's what we're going to get into next, where we kind of realize like, if we're going to go anywhere with this, as much as, you and I like talking about value investing and multi-factor investing and all the stuff, the videos we did at the beginning, like if we're going to go anywhere with this, and also if we're going to learn more from this, because there's probably only so much you and I can learn from each other. Like at a certain point, you've got to bring in somebody who's like an outside expert that looks at the world in different ways. So I think from both of those perspectives, it made sense to transition it to a guest podcast, which I think we did it was like 6 months in or something like that.
Yeah, it was, I think, right around that period. Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, like what you're going to hear a lot throughout this discussion is very few of these ideas are original to us. So, I mean, Toby started doing guest interviews. We were like, well, I think we should do guest interviews because let's, try to get people on that we were kind of running out of topics anyways. There's only so much you and I can talk about. So I think Toby was the first one we had. And, one of the things that I think we struggled with a little bit early on, and again, it's sort of overcoming this fear, is I knew Toby would do it. We kind of knew Toby personally at the time. He was like, telling us to go all in on content, but we were also like, why would anybody want to talk to us? I mean, why would they want to come on our podcast, which was very small at the time? But, what I would say is that the vast majority of people, even the larger guests that we've had, have been very open-minded to it. And a lot of these people embrace content and they sort of understand that these platforms are their way of getting out their brand, their name, their story, their narrative, whatever it might be. So, for us, I think, yeah, it was great. But I mean, Jack, in terms of bringing together an interview and sort of the challenges or the things that you have to do in preparation, what would you say are like the top things someone should be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, if our first interview with Toby, we didn't do a very good job. Like listening back to it, and also like we decided like the parts we didn't think we did well, we're just going to cut them. So there's like these weird transitions in there where it's actually like cutting. Now we pretty much run our interviews straight through. We don't, we really very rarely take anything out unless we have to. But like that one, I was when we were editing it, we're like, oh, should we take this out? Should we take that out? So yeah, we didn't do a very good job at the beginning, but doing a good interview is really hard. And it's a different thing. Like you and I at the beginning were looking at articles that we had written that we knew a lot about, and we just said, let's hop on and let's do it. Like the preparation to do a good interview is really hard. And also when you have two hosts, it's hard because you're asking, you have to get kind of into your cadence of who's going to ask questions and when they're going to ask them. So we're not jumping all over each other. So like a lot of that, we learned the preparation that was required over time. And, so now we have a pretty good process. And that's sort of what we're going to talk about. Like we do send in advance, like an outline of what we're going to discuss in the interview to all of our guests. And we think that's good for us because it gives us like sort of a guideline as to where we want to have like a story arc in everything we do. We want to like think about that person and what they have to teach people and how can we take that in an arc from the beginning to the end of an hour. And so doing that in advance and outlining that is really important in terms of doing that. But also like, and even like big guests we've had who are on a lot of podcasts have always said, with the exception of one, which we can talk about, but have always said, like, I really appreciate knowing in advance what we're going to talk about. And that doesn't mean, like, I think we did at the beginning, that is what we talked about. I think at the beginning, you and I were basically like reading off the questions and that's what we were doing. Now probably like 20 or 30% of the podcast goes off of sort of those topics we listed there. But I think it was really helpful for us. And I think it's really helpful for the guests as well.
And I think one of the things that people should think about, and I think we've over time migrated to this, is like you have certain strong skills with your interviewing methods and I have certain skills. So the way that Jack and I have kind of templated it out is I typically take the beginning and it's a little bit softer. It's a little bit more intro. There might be something humorous or complimentary sort of to the guest. Jack takes the hardcore, it might be quantitative factor or investment methodology or the more detailed questions in the middle, the meat of it. And then I sort of wrap it up at the end and try to button it up. So that's the process and the template that we've developed for us. Of course, we adjust and we pivot sometimes off of that, but that's sort of what works for us. The other thing that I think is important, and it's only happened a few times, but is you can become a little bit too reliant on the other person. So for example, if we're both interviewing someone and we have this list of questions and then Jack's power goes out and I'm on with, Rob Arnott, I better be able to, know generally what those questions are. I'm probably not going to be able to ask those questions as well as Jack, but I think I could push through. So I think, in preparing, it's, making sure that you have a good sense about what the general questions might be. And then if something goes wrong, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, what can go wrong, because pretty much for us, everything has gone wrong. But, I think just knowing that you're backed up and you're prepared, I think is important.
Well, it's funny you would bring up Rob Arnott around that topic, because if you can recall, like our biggest interview probably we ever got was when we got Rob. He was kind enough to come on the podcast and he was definitely our biggest guest we'd ever had by a wide margin. And I remember I was living in Georgia at the time, and I was sitting at my desk and the thing with bigger guests is, that you book them way in advance and you've got an hour of their time. Usually they've got something that's going right after you. And so like we get on with Rob Arnott and Justin, I believe it was your earphones that wouldn't work. Is that right?
I think the whole internet crapped out or something like that. Cause I don't know.
There was something going on. So basically, we've got like Justin is completely gone and we've got you've got your hour and that's it. So we've got a few minutes to figure it out. If we don't figure it out, Justin just can't be in it. And that's basically what happened. So to your point about having to be ready to do anything, I don't know how well I did, but I had to do Rob Arnott by myself because, you had a technical failure on your end. And so we started 5 minutes late and we did it. I don't know how well it worked out, but to your point, it's when you have the two hosts, you got to be ready for whatever happens, because we've had episodes where both of us have had issues and the other one just has to step in and do it.
No, you did a great job on that. And I give you a lot of credit because that was a big guest and you had to pretty much do it by yourself and it came out great. So, and that's kind of a testament to your, preparation on these things.
But also like, you're much better at the small talk stuff than I am, which is why at the beginning, it's great for you to intro it and me not to intro it. And I just reminded myself of that. I interviewed Andy Constant the other day and like, I'm like, oh crap, I got to like figure out at the beginning here how to like get into this thing because I never have to do that. And so that one's coming out next week, but it's an interesting, I'm probably good at asking very detailed questions and not as good at that kind of stuff. And you're good at that kind of stuff. So it ends up being a good balance.
In terms of securing guests, we kind of have a multi-pronged approach. I mean, we have, so there's a couple of different ways, and Jack, just let me riff on this for a second, and then you can sort of chime in. But we basically have sort of people that we might know of already that we admire. They're thought leaders in their respective fields, people like Rob Arnott, Michael Mauboussin, Jim O'Shaughnessy. These guys are pretty prolific with being on podcasts. They're sort of thought leaders in their respective fields. So obviously those are targets that we go after in terms of getting on excess returns. We then have people that I read about in the media that it might be a Wall Street Journal article referencing some academic paper. I'm not really looking for someone that's giving like a prediction about where the market's going next week. I mean, I'm more looking for evergreen type of investing related material that, will stand the test of time. And some of that lives in the academic world. Some of that lives in the practitioner world, but, sort of using the media and sourcing the media for that. We obviously use Twitter. Jack, some of our biggest guests have actually been people that you've learned about or got to know through Twitter. And then I think we have our general, and this kind of plays into Twitter, but I guess it's like the FinTwit / quantitative investing space. So guys like Corey Hofstein, Wes Gray, who else is in there? I mean, Kai Wu is kind of in that category. Those guys that are building investment strategies that are either quantitative or largely systematic in some way, shape, or form. And then there's like a network that lives and breathes. Adam Butler and the Resolve guys are another group. Great group. And these guys are all pretty forward leaning with content. So it's not a big ask for them to come on and join us. But, sourcing guests is an important thing. And then I'll just be quiet for a minute is, having like that backlog, like you can't go into each week not knowing who you're going to interview because then you're always going to be struggling. So I think, Jack does a good job of trying to get us at least a month or two out in advance booking. It doesn't always work that way, but that way you have 1 to 2 months lined up, and then you can work on the future months and potentially try to get even bigger guests. So that's the way we kind of work it.
Yeah. I think the most important thing is like, am I interested in what this person has to say? Where you can run into the traps of these things if you say, oh, I think a lot of people will watch this interview with this person. Well, it won't be, first, if it doesn't fit in like what you're trying to accomplish with the podcast, it doesn't really matter if a lot of people watch it. So like, I think where we've gotten off track sometimes is where we are bringing on people like, well, maybe this will do well on YouTube or something like that. I mean, what we really, when we do well, it's really, are we interested in like learning something from this guest? And that's how a lot of, you mentioned a lot of the guys from Twitter, like Jem Kersan that we've had on. I mean, that's how we got them is like, they had something new and innovative. Mike Green's another example. Like they had something new and innovative they were talking about. We were really interested in learning about it. And we thought maybe we could ask them questions a little bit differently than they've been asked in other podcasts. And so we brought them on. And so like, I think when we do that, when we let like our curiosity drive us, I think that's how we do well. But also I think, part of it is we want to have like a Venn diagram of people we're interested in talking to, but also like we do want to care about things that might do well. We are trying to grow the podcast. So when all you care about is things that might do well, you're going to do very badly. But when we can intersect those two things together, this is something our audience might want to see, but it's also something we're really interested in. I think that's when we've done the best. And the only other thing I would say on guests in terms of actually getting guests is guests, I think, look at the other guests. I think that's how you get guests is like, and one of the things we did well at the beginning is we knew a few people who had pretty good followings, like who we knew would come on because we knew them personally. Tobias Carlisle, Wes Gray, Jim O'Shaughnessy. I think they both were in the first 5 or 6 episodes. All three of those were in the first 5 or 6 episodes. And so once you see them up on the YouTube channel, that opens up a lot of doors in terms of being able to ask other people, because we always have guests when they come on, they'll say, oh, I was really impressed you were able to get X, Y, or Z person on there. And like that, whether it should or not, that plays a big role in getting other guests, is if they see guests like that they recognize, they're more willing to come on.
Let's talk a little bit about the repackaging or repurposing of content. And we've done that in 2 ways. And I'm going to kind of mix together 2 different things here. So we've done mashups, which I'll allow you to talk about, and I'll comment on that too. And then also, we've definitely tried our hand at Twitter Shorts and, promoting the other videos on social platforms. So those are very different things, but effectively what we're doing is we're taking pieces of these episodes, pieces of content, and we're trying to reuse them, repackage them, and get more mileage out of what we have. And so the first thing, Jack, is let's just walk through the experience, at least we have so far, with doing mashups.
Yeah. So the mashups are, well, taking a step back, the hardest podcasts, like the podcasts we do, are certainly challenging, but they're an easier type of podcast to make, which is we're filming an interview with somebody. We're basically taking that interview as is, we're putting it up. The mashups are kind of a different type of podcast. Like we just had Dan Villa on from AQR on, and so they had The Curious Investor, which is one of my favorite podcasts, but that was like a produced podcast. And so like with the produced podcasts, what you have is you have someone narrating, and then you're kind of inserting clips of audio or video as you go to create like a story arc and like a narrated podcast. And so the mashups were our attempt to do kind of what The Curious Investor does, which is we realized we had a lot of content from a lot of people answering like similar types of questions. What's the future of the 60-40 portfolio? Is value investing dead? Or like our standard closing question, what's the most important lesson you teach the average investor? We had a lot of people talking about similar topics. So can we put them together? We put Justin in the middle as a narrator, and we can create mashups around this stuff. And it's interesting, like we should actually be doing more of those. We haven't done one in a while, but like our most viewed episode of all time on YouTube is a mashup. And I think it's around that standard closing question, like what's the one lesson you teach the average investor? And at that point we had Rob Arnott and a bunch of big names on. And so we packaged those answers together into one thing, and it has like 30,000 views or something. It's our most viewed thing. So I think it's an interesting way to take like the insights of a bunch of different people. Usually we're getting the insights of one person and we're putting that in a package. It's interesting to be able to carve those out and say, let's get the insights of a bunch of different people who have different opinions about the same thing.
Yeah. And so just so people can kind of visualize the way that had to work is Jack identified the clip. He pulled the clip out of the podcast. He then wrote the script for the most part for me. I then went in, downloaded all the clips, read all the scripts, applied the labels or the captions in between the video. So you have the video, you have that person's audio, obviously. And then as you transition to the next video, you have me reading the script with the transition slide and then moving into the next clip. So that's sort of how all that works. But to Jack's point about the production aspect of it, it does take, that even though what we produced, it still wasn't tons and tons of work. It wasn't like we were going to an outside producer and doing music and all that kind of stuff, but there was still pretty heavy, I guess, post-production or editing aspect to producing that.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing for, we should just point out is for people who do podcasts, you don't have to do all this yourself. I mean, we've decided to do it. We don't want to pay an outside person. And also because we know the content so well, like it's very easy for us to edit it. Like if we finish an interview and we know exactly, or this one thing has to come out at 42 minutes, like it's much easier for me to edit it than it is for me to send it out. But a lot of podcasts don't do that. I mean, there's people who are really good at this where you can just send it out and you can just film your podcast and then you can pay someone to handle the back end part of it.
I don't know if I told you this. I was just a couple of weeks ago, I was recently like in a social setting and somebody that I knew I had a podcast, and we were talking to like another set of people that I was meeting for the first time, and they were genuinely interested in like the podcast. So I was talking about it. And then one of the guys asked me like, what's your favorite episode? And like, I was like, that is a great question. I like really struggled because I was thinking in my mind, like trying to go through like all the guests we had. And then I'm like, you know what? I think my favorite episode is like that mashup we did with like the 70 experts on the one thing you would teach your average investor, because that's taking like thoughts from, 70 different people. It included us, but the vast majority were guests that we had. And it really captures like the essence and the diversity of the type of knowledge that is being shared on the podcast. So I don't know. For us, I'm glad we do those mashup episodes. I think, like you said, we should do more when we have a nice topic to cover. And, that was the one, as I thought about it more, that was the one that jumped out to me as, being one of our more valuable ones.
Yeah. That's the one we had to do without narration, because obviously when you have 70 lessons, like asking Justin to narrate in between 70 different lessons was, first of all, right. It made it really long. I mean, that thing was 3 hours long on its own. But that also gets back to the idea of like, a lot of this is, one of the lessons I learned is, the quality of your content is certainly the most important thing, but there's so many things you can do around the edges to get that content in front of other people. And so I think at the beginning, I was like, we're going to do this stuff. We're going to put it out there. Whoever wants to watch it can watch it. But there's so much more that goes on in terms of experimentation. We already talked about transitioning from just you and I to interviews. Like YouTube covers, titling of these things, like how long they are, when you release them. And, that episode was 3 hours. So that episode was an episode we wanted to do, but it was also an experiment on our end. Like what happens if we put out a 3-hour episode? We'd change when we released that relative to the other episodes, like the timing of it. So there's so much stuff behind the scenes that I've kind of come around to the idea that if people are going to spend time with us to do an interview, like it's sort of our obligation to do everything we can to get as many people to watch that as possible. And so we emphasize a lot more. We spend a lot of time around YouTube covers and titling and that kind of stuff to try to learn how we can get these in front of more people. If we're going to spend the time to do the interview, we should spend the time to try to do that stuff as well.
Now, what would you say our experience or takeaway or learning is from YouTube Shorts and our content?
Yeah, I didn't think they were. I mean, we did a lot of them, and we're going to start doing them again probably, especially around that closing question, because that question, like, what's the most important lesson you teach the average investor? That's an easy thing to turn into a YouTube short. Mm-hmm. And some of the ones we did, like especially the Jack Schwager ones, where he talked about the biggest lesson from Steve Cohen or Paul Tudor Jones, like those two still do really well. But like the YouTube shorts were a decent amount of work. They probably weren't worth like our time. There was a pretty big process in that. Like, you got to find the clip, you got to get it down to a minute, which is really hard, which often involves like speeding up the audio or chopping certain parts of it out. Like I'd send it to you and you would wrap like some titling around it. And then we would get, those captions are really important on YouTube shorts, because I think a lot of people are listening to it without audio. So like having the captions right, like it was just a lot of work. So I didn't think, like, for us, like we're doing short clips on Twitter, which I think is better. They don't have to be a minute. They can be as long as we want them to be. And all this other stuff is not, we don't have to do captions, and it's just, I think it's better for us to do these clips on Twitter. But so I didn't find a lot of value in YouTube shorts, but I know like people with different types of content have, found like enormous value with shorts.
Yeah. And I think it's just the way that people digest and they scroll through the feed. It's not like, it's like the next video or the next video. I mean, there might be something really valuable in there, but no one's pausing for a second and saying, let me subscribe to this channel. You might get a lot of views, but the actual call to action in terms of getting subscribers or repeat followers, is probably, even though the algorithm, YouTube will figure out who's digesting that content. It's just, I think our stuff is hard to kind of leverage like the YouTube short format.
Yeah. Like, when does anyone ever give us like a 1-minute answer to anything? Like, that basically never happens. So just as a starting point, you're dealing with something that's much longer than a minute, and you've got to try to get it down to a minute, which is really hard. You have to speed up the audio and you got to cut things out. It's just, for us, it was, I mean, I think there was a point where I was doing 2 a day. We were putting like 2 YouTube shorts out a day for a month or 2, I think. And, we were probably getting like 30 subscribers a month or something from that. Like, and it just wasn't worth, like, I don't know if our content's a great fit for it, and it just wasn't worth it. I mean, I think we're going to try to do a little bit of it again in the future, but for us, I didn't think it was worth it.
So let's just talk a little bit more about experimentation. So we've, I guess in the last maybe 6 to 12 months, maybe a little bit longer than 12 months on Show Us Your Portfolio, but we've been doing 2 other types of shows now. Let me kind of set this up because it's important. So we have the Excess Return podcast, which has its own channel on YouTube and its own audio feed. But then underneath Excess Returns, we have one show that's called Show Us Your Portfolio, which we'll talk about. And then we have another show called Education of a Financial Planner, but Education of a Financial Planner actually has its own audio feed. So it has its own podcast audio feed on the audio side. So hopefully people can follow that, because as we talk about these things that we're doing, it's important to kind of, understand the context that we're talking about them in. So let's first talk about Show Us Your Portfolio. So Jack, you came up with this idea. I'll let you describe it and then I'll comment on it, but it's just, we call it Show Us Your Portfolio.
Yeah, and this kind of gets to the idea of the importance of experimentation. Going back to the beginning, from you and I just talking to interviews, like, we have an interesting platform to be able to just try things. What's the worst that's going to happen? If we try something and nobody watches it, like, who cares? So the idea was Show Us Your Portfolio, and this kind of gets back to that book, Josh Brown wrote. It's really interesting to me to think about how people I respect as investors manage their own portfolios. And so it was like, well, why don't we do a series inside of Excess Returns? Because it fits pretty well with the goals of Excess Returns. Why don't we do a series inside Excess Returns where we talk to these people about how they manage their personal money? Now, there's a big problem with that, though, right from the get-go, which is people don't want to talk about how they manage their personal money. And especially, they don't want to talk about, like, here are my holdings or anything like that. That's kind of considered in like our society, that's sort of private information. They certainly don't want to talk about their value of their holdings or the actual tickers they hold or anything like that. So it's a challenge at the beginning to do something like that and to show people that you're going to do it in such a way where they're not going to, where what they think it's going to be is not what it's actually going to be. It's really going to be about your strategy, maybe overall asset allocation stuff, but really what it's about is your strategy for thinking about building your personal portfolio towards the goals you're trying to accomplish in your life. And so we were really lucky with Show Us Your Portfolio in that we had a friend, Med Faber, who had written a long article himself already about how he manages his personal portfolio. So we knew Meb was comfortable talking about the topic. So when we had the idea to do it, we're like, well, we got to reach out to Meb. We know he'll do it. And once Meb did it, we did it in such a way that it then opened up other people. Like I think Wes Gray was our second person we did it with. And, as we've been able to show people what we actually do versus the concerns about, personal information, we've been able to expand it. But I think it's probably, if you look at everything we do right now and you look at like the popularity of it, both on the audio and on the video side, Show Us Your Portfolio is number one. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can guarantee those always do very well, no matter what. So I think that's something we'll do more and more of. And it goes back to the idea of, we're trying to do stuff that personally interests us. And like every one of those we do, we've talked to a lot of guys that do a lot of different things, but every one of them we do, there's like something new I learned, some little nuance about the way someone manages their portfolio that I didn't think about. So, we're going to try to keep doing those because I think they're interesting for us, but they've also, they've proved pretty popular.
Yeah. And in terms of stuff we're interested in, so this next one, the education of a financial planner. So this idea came out of, as a firm, we've been trying to do more, this is through our advisory firm. We've been trying to do more financial planning. Like I would say light financial planning. We subscribe to a financial planning software package. We've been doing work with some of our investors, some of our potential investors on sort of planning type strategies and needs. And so Jack went and got a CFP. So the idea was, what if we did a podcast around the education of a financial planner? Now, because Jack and I don't necessarily, our career hasn't been spent in the financial planning realm necessarily. I think we had this idea, but we didn't really know where to start with it. And then we met our co-host on this podcast called Matt. His name is Matt Ziegler. He's a financial advisor at Some Point Investments. And, he's been doing this for, I think, almost 20 years. And Matt brings a very different, creative, thoughtful view, a different view than Jack and I bring. And so, we decided to kind of start this new podcast, Education of a Financial Planner. A lot of times it's us talking about financial planning concepts, but we have had some guests on there and stuff. And this is another example of something we were interested in, something we were actually embarking on professionally in our business. And, let's launch a podcast around it and try to educate along the way.
Yeah, this kind of comes from our belief about like where the asset management, financial planning, where all of this is going. In general, the asset management business, there's all kinds of automation being introduced in the asset management business. I think it's really important both from our perspective to be able to now do financial planning for clients, but also it's important business-wise as well, because ultimately that's something where you're developing a personal relationship with someone. And as you try to grow your business, that's something that's not going to be automated away. I mean, I don't see how financial planners are ever going to get automated away. So we started from the perspective of this would be a really good thing to do for clients. And so then I go take the CFP exam. And as part of the CFP exam, you realize like this stuff is, you can definitely learn this stuff, but this is an applied thing. You have to learn this in the real world. Like you're not going to come out of the CFP exam and suddenly be doing advanced financial planning for people. So as I thought about that, I'm like, well, maybe what we could do is I've got a lot to learn as a financial planner. You're going to do planning as well. You've got a lot to learn. Well, maybe what we could do is we could actually document that journey as we go. So we can find somebody who's an established financial planner who knows the things, the real world stuff we want to know. And we could just interview him and ask about the topics. And so that's where that came from. And all of this, it's a common theme with all this. All this comes out of our curiosity. Like we're trying to learn. And then it's like, if we're going to learn this stuff, we might as well do it, in public. So we launched this as part of our, as you said, we launched it as a separate audio podcast, and, we launched it as part of our YouTube channel. Yeah, it's been a good learning experience for us. I mean, it's also like channel wise, it's introduced some challenges because one of the things about the YouTube algorithm is the YouTube algorithm really learns who your viewer is and what they want. It really like narrows in, as we know, like we're getting, you get personalized ads across the internet that you're like, how does it even know I want that? Like all these algorithms are very good at narrowing in on exactly like a certain audience. And so this has been a challenge for us in terms of like, we're shifting a little bit the types of stuff we're doing here. We're talking about the basics of college planning or the basics of retirement planning, and that's a little bit outside of our audience. So it's been a process. We've kind of got it going now, but at the beginning it was like, well, we put these videos out on financial planning and they're getting watched way less than everything else. And, that I don't think that was a function of the quality of the videos. It was a function of we've developed this certain audience that wants a certain thing, and now we're giving them another thing. And it just goes to this whole idea of you have to learn and pivot with YouTube over time. And, this is something we've had to do, but, we don't want to have like the YouTube algorithm drive what our podcast is. Ultimately we want to put out valuable content. And I think the planner stuff is really valuable content. So whether it gets watched as much as our other stuff or not, I don't really care. We want to do it and we want to learn from it. But that's another example of us sort of pivoting as we've gone along.
Let's just talk about recording equipment, the platform we use to record, how this stuff is edited, and the different programs that we use. So let's start at the podcasting platform we're recording on, which is riverside.fm, right? FM, not
Yes.
FM. Okay, FM,
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah. So like let's just take it right to the beginning. Like, so we obviously what we needed at the beginning is we wanted to have a decent mic to record on. Like you are actually these days, and we'll get to this, like you could pretty much use AirPods, with the kind of or software there is to improve audio. You don't need a good mic, but I have the ATR 2100. I don't know what you have, but it was good to have a decent mic and a decent webcam, but that's really all you need from a hardware perspective. And then it becomes, well, how are we going to record this? And, one of the problems you run into when you use like Zoom or something like that is if the internet quality goes down, the quality of the reporting goes down as well. And so there's these platforms now. Riverside is one, Squadcast is one. We use Riverside, but there's these platforms now that record the video and audio locally on the person's machine and kind of uploads it as you go. And so what that saves you is if there's any kind of problem with the internet cutting out, it does not affect the quality of the video in any way. So we've used Riverside like pretty much since the beginning, I think. I mean, I think we did maybe one or two on Zoom at the beginning, but we pretty much used Riverside. And then on the editing, it sort of transitioned. At the beginning, you were doing all the editing through, what was the program you used?
It was Camtasia, and I still use that. I don't want to discount that. It's a very powerful program, and it does different things, but that I was doing most of the editing, most of the cutting in that, but that ended up being not as efficient as what you're using.
Yeah. So, and then we found out about Descript, which is a really cool program. And the cool thing about Descript is it allows you to edit video using text. So when you put a video in there, it transcribes the video, and you can just cut the words out of the transcript, and it cuts that part of the video out. And so Descript has become like, now I do all the editing there, and it's so easy in terms of just taking those files from Riverside, bringing them into Descript, dropping the intro and the outro on there, editing the parts we need to edit. And it also has this thing called Studio Sound, which is really cool. That's what I was referencing before, which is it's just this little toggle button you switch and basically takes bad audio and makes it like studio quality audio. So, all of that as a combined package makes, editing these things is very, very easy now. We don't have to spend too much time. I mean, the hardest part about editing it is actually watching it back. And for me, like you referenced at the beginning, I hate watching myself, but like taking the time to actually watch it is the most time consuming part. The actual editing is incredibly simple.
Yeah, and just a few other things that I guess are important. I do use Canva for our cover images, which Canva is a very powerful, like web-based. It's almost like Adobe Photoshop maybe, but you can edit images and do different logos, and it's a pretty powerful program for sure. It's pretty cost effective. I use my iPhone to record and for audio. So while you're seeing, I had somebody comment recently that one of my videos looked great and what camera was what I was using, and I'm just using my iPhone for recording purposes. And then one of the things we don't do, which I think I could see the value in them, because just recently I started to kind of scroll through transcripts a little more. We don't do transcribing of our podcast. That's something we've tried to do with some of these programs, but we haven't yet been able to find something that's really good at doing it accurately. I think a lot of people that do transcribe are probably like hiring, someone to do it on a one-off episode basis and maybe paying like, I don't know what it is, $20 per episode or something like that. But we're not quite there yet on the transcripts.
Yeah, no, if you want to get a really good quality transcript that like is going to read perfectly, you've got to pay someone to do it. There's the automated ones are getting way and way better, but we just weren't comfortable like putting them up because they're still not perfect. And I also don't know. I'm not sure if people have an appetite to read our transcripts or not. But yeah, so we haven't done it yet, but you can definitely do it. It's just a matter of you got to pay a decent transcription service to do it, to get it right.
So as we get sort of to the end of this episode, I guess, let's talk about maybe two other things. Let's talk about what are some of the, what we've talked about, some of the core key lessons that we think, at least for us, have been important in helping us, get to where we are today and hopefully, continue to grow this in the future. And then maybe to wrap it up, we can talk a little bit about sort of YouTube and what we've learned. I think that, people are just genuinely interested in that because YouTube's such a tough code to crack. Not that we've cracked it at all, but there are some things we might be able to share. So yeah, let's start out with Jack with like, I don't know, the top, 5 or 6 lessons that for us has been, I guess, most important.
Yeah, well, to me, taking a step back at the beginning, like the most important thing is you have to enjoy doing this because this is not a lucrative thing. I mean, I think we generate like $300 a month in YouTube ad revenue, and we generate $0 a month in ad revenue on the audio side. So we're not generating much money. Like we did this because we enjoy doing it, and we did it because it was an opportunity for us. We work from home, and we always have worked from home, and so we don't get as many networking opportunities as other people do. So it was an opportunity for us to meet a lot of people we would have had no chance to meet otherwise. So if those are the 2 reasons you do it, then you're going to do it regardless of how many people watch it. And, there's definitely, to your point, like at the beginning, there's definitely been periods where my mother was basically the person watching this, or my father or whatever. So, you have to be able to, if you can accept that and you're going to keep going, I think it's a really good thing to do. But you see, most podcasts don't do that. Most podcasts realize it's a lot of work, realize, they don't have the audience they want, and then they head out, which is why, I don't know what percentage, it was something like, it's definitely greater than 50% of podcasts have not had any episode in the past 3 months or something like that. If you do the stats, it's like most podcasts just die eventually because it is a lot of work. So you've got to do it because you like doing it. And the other thing is like, that kind of ties into persistence, which has been important for us, is just stick with it. Like it's, even when no one was watching it, we're certainly not huge now. We kept doing it, and we kept, it's persistence combined with like the ability to pivot and innovate around what you're doing. So, we stuck with it, but we didn't stick with it and say, let's just keep filming Jack and Justin talking about articles for 5 years. And like, eventually things are going to, get better for us. It was like, let's be persistent, but let's also look at what could we do different? We brought on guests. We did Show Us Your Portfolio. We did the education of a financial planner. We're doing this, which is going to be a behind the podcast thing with some of our favorite investing podcasts. We have some channel collaborations with other channels coming up we're going to do. So we're trying to like create the content we want to create, but also learn as we go and try to new things. So to me, those are, I don't know if you have anything on those, but those are probably the biggest lessons for me.
Well, I would just add, like, and I made this point earlier, it's not going to be perfect probably ever, and it's especially not going to be perfect out of the gate. So being able to sort of understand that, but also knowing, to be honest with you, we say this to all our guests, and we don't do tons of editing, but anything can be edited out, taken out, moved around, filler words can be removed. So, these programs have gotten very powerful with being able to take big screw ups, which there's been pretty much, a lot of screw ups for us, and being able to make these things look like that they've gone off seamlessly. And very few of our podcasts ever have. And so you just got to kind of be able to, I guess, understand that and not get shaken when kind of something goes wrong, but you need to be able to bounce back and then just come back strong with the next one. That's what I'd say.
Yeah. And, on the stuff about, what can go wrong is going to go wrong. So we've had every possible thing, every technical error on our side, on the guest side. Someone's just talking and then they're frozen. You can't see them, or, we're doing an interview and suddenly like Jack's not even there anymore, like on the screen, like my computer. I remember this was the one we were doing with, I think it was the return stacking one with Corey Hofstein and Rodrigo. But like, I just disappeared for like 15 minutes because I had to reboot my computer and like the interview must go on. So like we've had everything, dogs barking, like, babies, like, I mean, anything that could go wrong will, but like you said, I mean, it can all be taken out after the fact, and you just kind of roll with it and you can fix it up, and it's not a big deal. So yeah, that was definitely one of the things we learned as well.
So just this last point, and then I guess we'll wrap it up. I mean, we probably could continue to go here, but, and hopefully the episodes we have with our other guests on this, behind the scenes, will fill in some of the blanks if we've left some blanks sort of filled here, but is sort of what we've learned with YouTube, I guess. And, Jack, I know you spent a lot of time studying YouTube, looking at our videos, looking at our click-through rates, thinking about covers, asking me to update covers, thinking about the descriptions, thinking about the titles.
You get mad at me for asking you to update covers.
I have a limit of a 2 cover request. After that, I ignore Jack's emails. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, this is, and every channel's different, and the content on YouTube is all over the place. And we're not like, we always joke around, we're going to do our doom and gloom episode where it's like, you, me, or you, me and Matt with our shocked faces and like calling for the end of the world or like a 50% drop in stocks, because that's the only way it seems like on YouTube sometimes you can get a video to really blow up, but we're sort of trying to keep our standards there and not do that. So.
Yeah, obviously, there's a certain type of podcast we want to produce. And to some degree, some of the stuff that works really well on YouTube is not something we're going to produce because it doesn't do any good for anybody. Obviously predicting stock market crashes or day trading or, promising thousands of % returns. I mean, that does no one any good. So, we're not going to do any of that stuff. But yeah, it's been really interesting to like think about YouTube and how it works. The general thing, the way to understand YouTube is what YouTube controls is they serve effectively these covers to people. So when you go to youtube.com, you're going to see a bunch of covers with titles. So they're serving those covers and titles. And so if I'm YouTube, how do I determine how I serve those? So I want to make money through advertising. So I want people to click on those covers. And when they click, I want them to watch as long as possible because that allows me to serve advertising. So a function of how you get your covers up there more is a function of those two variables. It's a function of the click-through rate. How often when your cover is served to somebody, do they click on it? And then once they click on it, how long do they watch? Basically the math of those two things becomes how often your videos get served. And so that's everything we've been doing is trying to figure out like, how do we optimize around that? And that goes back to the beginning point is it would be great if you could just say, I'm going to make great content and it'll, people will watch it, but it's not that simple. Like there's a lot of people making really great content. And so if you can pay attention to these details around the edges, you can get more people to watch your content. And so we've learned a lot about, we don't do over the top titles and we don't do over the top covers, but we have learned a lot about how to make, the titles in certain ways like that our audience will respond to and that other people will respond to. I mean, you've experimented. I mean, you can talk about covers, but I mean, you've experimented with all kinds of different covers in terms of how you do it and what the image is and how many words are on the cover and how big the words are. And we've learned a lot, and you can probably talk to what those lessons are, but we've learned a lot about all that stuff and we're getting better. We're certainly not Mr. Beast here by any stretch. There's a lot of people that do it a lot better than we do, but we have learned a lot as we've gone.
Yeah, I would say with the covers, where we've tended to go is I have like covers are split into where there's like contrasting colors. Usually there's either one or two bright colors. So you want to stand out. There's usually a picture of the person, or in some cases, headshots of multiple people. Usually I try to highlight like the big sort of, whether it's inflation or the guests we're talking to, have that name really pop out on the cover. And then also there's usually some like center image. So, we just, this is kind of a creative thing that I think with a recent cover we did where Cullen Roach, we had him on a Show Us Your Portfolio episode. And I was kind of like trying to think about like what he talked about. And at the end of the interview, we were talking about things that he did like outside of investing that might not result in like a big payoff. And he started talking about like gardening. So like, what I did in Canva is I took like a watering bucket, like a flower watering gardening thing. And, I put that in the middle of the image along with like a stack of money. And, that was I had to combine two separate images, get a little bit creative. And, that actually episode did pretty good, had a pretty good click through. And it was a combination of, Cullen's picture, the colors, and also I think that center image being something a little bit more unique, something that's just not a canned standard image coming out of their stock images where I had to create two things. So anyways, but you know what, with that being said, there's plenty of covers I've created where I'm like, this thing's going to have like a 6% click-through rate. And then like within like 3 hours, Jack's emailing me, can you change the cover on this? This is, so you never know. You have to experiment with a lot of it. And, we do change our covers. So we try to be dynamic in that sense where, we're trying to improve these things.
And, we kind of operate in a vacuum. So I really don't, we studied a little bit, but I don't really know what a good like click-through rate on a cover is. For us, anything above 4% is really good. Like if we get above 4%, we're very happy with that. And they'll always come down over time because again, going back to the idea of the YouTube algorithm, it's trying to push this stuff to as many people as possible. So if your audience responds with a high click-through rate, it's going to expand to a bigger audience and give it to them. And then it's going to expand to a bigger audience. And so with our episodes, it'll always do that until the click-through rate comes down to like a more reasonable level. It's just a matter of how far it gets. Like one that does really well, like Jem Kersan was an example of this. Like it started out with like a 7.5% click-through rate or something. By the time it finally expanded it and the click-through rate came down, tens of thousands of people had watched it. So whereas other ones, it just starts low and stays low. Like some of our planning ones, we've had trouble like figuring out how to get good covers on there. So we can certainly get covers that are in like the 1% to 2% range when it doesn't go well. So It's a process. I mean, we're learning about all of it, and I definitely didn't expect I'd be like I thought I'd be like spending all my time studying great investors and not studying Mr. Beast. But that is, I kind of do a little bit of both now. I try to study like people on YouTube that have learned how to grow channels, as well as study people on the investing side.
Yeah, and two other things we put in the description. You do a good job of doing the timestamps. So in all of our descriptions, we have maybe anywhere between 12 and 25 different timestamps that allows the user to jump to different sections. I don't know the engagement on YouTube in terms of clicking those, but I can tell you when we do our emails to our user base highlighting these episodes, we definitely get clicks into those specific areas of the podcast. So I think, the more sort of ways you can parse out the important sections of the podcast, I think it's probably good for viewers. And the other thing is, acknowledging and responding to comments is something, we try to do our best. And whether if it's a positive comment or a thoughtful comment, at the very least, I'm giving a thumbs up or thanking the viewer or responding to it. And then the other thing you can do is, pinning the best comment on top is kind of good. So you, as the creator, or I guess studio editor, of the channel, you have the ability to pin the comment to the top so that when people are looking at the video, if they see like a really nice, valuable comment, like, wow, this video was awesome, I learned so much, that's going to, on the margin influence and impact what somebody thinks about, watching the video, viewing the video. It can only probably be helpful.
Yeah. And I was just thinking about when you said that, like, if I think about like what the approach we've taken that's worked, I mean, I think a lot of it is just little incremental changes over time. We've talked about a lot of that here. And that goes in terms of making the podcast better, like becoming better interviewers, making the product better, but also growing it. Like all of that has been little changes. Like we just try to incrementally make this little change and get a little bit better here, make a little change, get a little bit better here. And like that tends to snowball over time. And, we've got a long way to go. So, I mean, we've got a lot more, that snowball is pretty small right now, hopefully to what it will be eventually in terms of us getting better doing this. But that's been the theme of all of this, is like, we've tried to pay attention to detail and we try to get a little better each time we do it.
So listen, this may spark some questions. If you guys want to contact us and ask us anything, either publicly or offline, about, anything we've talked about here or anything we haven't, please feel free to do so. And then, like I said at the beginning, this is the first of, what is hopefully going to be a series of behind the scenes of the podcast episodes that we do with other people that are producing, valuable content and putting it out there. So we really appreciate you guys hanging in there with us this long and watching, and we'll see you on the channel. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Justin again. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Excess Returns. You can follow Jack on Twitter at @PracticalQuant and follow me on Twitter at @JJCarbonell. If you found this discussion interesting and valuable, please subscribe in either iTunes or on YouTube, or leave a review or a comment. We appreciate it.
Justin Carbonell and Jack Forehand are principals at VALIDEA Capital Management. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of VALIDEA Capital. No information on this podcast should be construed as investment advice. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of clients of VALIDEA Capital.